So, how did you come about writing a book? Because I know my experience with writing a book was I had no desire to write one, and then it just kind of came in where somebody asked me to write. So,
So
where'd you go?
the quick answer is it evolved out of my teaching. Had I not taught, I wouldn't have had the material to put together for a book.
Mm,
So the question is, how did I start teaching?
mm,
Against my will was how it happened. I met Stuart Pivar at a gallery opening, and we were talking, and was talking about my experience with anatomy and dissecting and my sculpting. And he, off the cuff, said, "Okay, I want you to teach anatomy at my school." And I said, "I don't know how to teach. I don't know how to teach anatomy. I've never done it. I've never taught before. It's a subject I know something about, but how to communicate it is another whole thing." So he said, he kind of twisted my arm, and I kind of agreed to consider it. And I said, "Okay, when do we start?" He says, in 3 weeks. I said, "Okay, so I have to come up with a 16-week semester course in 2 weeks." He says, "No, no, no. You just need to get the first lesson done in 2 weeks. Then you have another week for the next lesson and another week." So, I mean, I really loved the topic. So it was easy to twist my arm to be involved in it. I was insecure that, people are not going to get their money's worth if I've never done this before.
mm,
But I'm methodical in things I do, so I thought it out and figured out a way to do it. And as a sculptor, dealing with three-dimensional form, the simplest thing is to recreate three-dimensional form using teaching aids. And that was the key to my teaching, was to make it easy for me by having everything I needed to communicate the nature of three-dimensional form
mm.
of anatomy. And so I already had some stuff. I had a skeleton, human skeleton. I had a number of human skeletons, but I can't remember the sequence. I think I had, before this, Stuart asked me to teach, I had a human skeleton that was painted with the origins and insertions. Eventually I put elastic between the origin insertion in basically the center area of each origin, each attachment, and then connected the elastic so I could move the skeleton around and see how muscles go between things, over things, under things. Made it very simple. And that came from Leonardo. Leonardo in his notes said, take a skeleton and attach copper wires where the muscles begin and end.
Mm.
I guess they didn't have elastic for garters and whatnot back then, but it seemed to make sense to use the elastic. Then I could move it. I did that on the dog skeleton, which is behind us here.
Mm.
And those are my copper wires on the center of attachments as Leonardo had instructed. And it was just amazing to see in an instant every muscle and where it goes without anything being obscured. The problem with teaching anatomy is much is obscured. So if a muscle dies between two other muscles, you can't see where it goes. That's why you have to learn anatomy. So you learn where it goes, you visualize the point of where it ends, and then it's clear in your mind. So to have these axes, whether it's copper or elastic, just made my job easy, made my ability to understand it easy, and then to communicate it. So I could communicate the attachments in class with this skeleton that was painted with the attachments, and then have the elastic on it. So that made that easy. Then another component would be the model. So we had the model, we had living anatomy there, and I kind of insisted of getting defined models so it would make it easier. Easier for me to see, easier for the students to see, easier for them to understand it. Then, so jumping ahead, eventually I got to work with cadavers. I arranged through a friend who studied at Hunter College School of Physical Therapy. I met the professor there who was the head of the department, who was really nice and invited us to come there. So I did some dissecting, and then I decided to do some dissection casts there. They gave me permission to do that. So I brought some students, and we made the molds of the cadavers. I dissected them a little bit more fully. They were interested in getting, the students at physical therapy were interested in nerves, arteries, and muscles. I was only interested in muscles and the skeleton and the attachments.
Mm.
So after they were all finished, then I could go in and I could get rid of those annoying things like arteries and nerves. And then I cleaned it up so that you had great clarity where the muscle form was clearly evident. It's simple. It's like logical, obvious way to make these models so that they communicate exactly what you want. And then to preserve that, I made the molds and then made plaster casts. And I made a set for Hunter in gratitude for their letting us come in, a couple of sets for the New York Academy. I had sets, and then I think a number of them were sold through Sculpture House Casting. There was sort of a flurry of activity of people acquiring the sets. There were 13 different casts of different regions of the body taken from 8 different individuals. So I waited till they got this very muscular individual, and the musculature was nicely revealed, and they tend to dry out or be thin, some of the cadavers. So I waited till we got a good one. And so that was the other element of explaining in class what the muscles are and the attachments are is the cadaver. And we didn't have a cadaver in class every day, but we had the dissection casts. And then I labeled them. So when you're looking at a white muscle going into white attachment next to another white muscle and white fascia and stuff, so I would add dotted lines and labels and all sorts of information. So it was really clear. It was interesting to look at a labeled dissection cast and look at it next to an unlabeled one. The amount of comprehension in just simply labeling it makes it so clear. So I spent time putting together these teaching aids. So I had the painted skeleton with the elastic, the dissection cast, the live models, and that was basically what I used to help explain three-dimensional form to the students. And without any of these, I don't think I could have done it.
So the school you're referring to is New York Academy of Art, right? That's where Stuart was?
Yes. And it was when it was on Lafayette Street. That's when I came in.
So what were you doing before then?
Getting in trouble. I was sculpting, and this was in the 80s.
Teaching as well?
No, I never taught before. Never taught anything before.
So
that's why I was a little reluctant to teach in this school where we're going to be very talented students, and limited amount of time. I had one semester to get the whole course. Every muscle had to be covered. I couldn't say, "Oh, I'm sorry, we didn't do the 8 crucial muscles now that we're up at the superficial level." So it was a lot of pressure to get it done, but it all worked out. I kept very good notes, and to answer your question, those notes became the book.
Yeah, that's the thing. So being organized as a teacher led to you having the material there. So when the book or the publisher, did you go to a book or publisher to pitch a book?
Yeah, let me get to that, but I just want to finish sort of the process in the classroom that led to the book. So I kept very good notes. I'm very organized. I kept very good notes, and I created this écorché approach to teaching it, and I made the armatures for each student, and then they sculpted a skeleton on top of it, and then added the muscles. We did this in plastiline clay, and I had about 18 or so students per class, and I did 2 classes a day, one part of the Academy's master program. It was not Masters of Fine Arts. They just called the initial program Masters. And then I did a continuated at night. So I did a lot of muscles over the years, twice a day. So I got very good at it. And that really helped for me to really learn the stuff well, get it really clear in my mind, and then pursue the book. So one of the things I did in class was, besides sculpting the actual miniature muscle in its complex three-dimensional form, I did diagrams on the blackboard. So having studied with Michael Aviano, who taught me how to see, how to think, he just was the most unbelievable experience beyond art. I looked at, and then a lot of books have these simplifications. So if I were to explain, one of the examples is the Earth. So if I say, let's have a concept of what the Earth is like in its most simplest form. We don't start with buildings and lakes and trees. We start with a sphere. That's the simplest volume that we can use to represent the Earth. So how do I do that in anatomy? Well, there's a lot of talk about salamis. It's like a salami. It's an extended salami because muscles are elongated and rounded. But then you get some things like the latissimus. So it's kind of tricky to get this sort of flattened muscle that's thickened in certain areas, that have tendon in certain areas, that wrap around the body and twist and turn. So that gets really complicated. So how do we start with the simplest concept for every single structure? Like a long bone, like the femur, you can think of as a stick. Then you think of it as a stick with an expansion at each end.
Right.
And then you further develop it. But if you don't have that stick with a swelling at each end clear in your mind to the correct proportion, to the correct orientation, if you can't get that stick right, you'll never add the complexity accurately.
Yeah.
So these conceptions, these early simple conceptions, are very important. I love doing it. It was something that I sort of looked forward to. How am I going to figure this out? So latissimus is a triangle. So basically I do a triangle on the board, horizontal upper edge, vertical other edge near the spine, and then the free edge was on an angle. And then I added a sort of a long tendon on one side and then a short tendon on the other. So I had this triangle that evolved into, this triangle, then triangle with tendons, and then this flat triangle that wrapped a little bit. And I did these drawings on the board. And each time I did it, I did a little bit better. It says, oh, that doesn't really communicate it. That's not clear. So it was like a workshop for me teaching.
Yeah.
And just developing how to do the presentation, simple as possible. Because there's complexity going to be heaped onto this later on. And again, if you don't have the initial conception really clear, you're going to be building on something that's not accurate, not a good foundation.
Right.
And then I would copy my drawings into my notes, so the next time I could use that. And then if I improved it, I redraw that. And I did a conception of just about everything. And you can see in my book, there's like a zillion of them. And so that adds to how the information was presented. So I've got, individual parts, and then I have the simplified conceptions of the individual parts. Then, having studied with Michael and thinking about, and Bridgman, George Bridgman, studying his books, the mass conception was very important. You can't just pile up a whole lot of details and come up with something that's valid. You have to have an overall conception of how all these details fit together.
Right.
So again, if you're trying to build a model of the earth, you don't start with a tree and start with a lake and start with a horse. You have to start with a sphere, and then you can do a landmass, and you can do this. You go from simple to complex.
Yeah.
So there's been mass conceptions over the years, starting with Cambiasso in the Renaissance, and I love George Bridgman's very dynamic anatomy, constructive anatomy. I love that stuff. It doesn't appeal to everybody. It just appealed to me. I like the sort of the mechanics, the dynamics. It was very dynamic. You sort of want to, Michael also talked about harmony and contrast. We have elegant flowing and then abrupt dynamics. That would be the harmonious, beautiful flow, and then the contrast, the dynamics. In music and all art, you've got, these elements to think about.
Absolutely.
So as far as the mass conceptions go, having been exposed to these over the years in art school and in books and through my teachers, as a sculptor, I thought the best way I can get these clear in my mind is to sculpt them, because they are three-dimensional. I don't have the skills to draw out of my mind, all these complex volumes or even simple volumes. I know 1 point, 2 point perspective, but to do it three-dimensionally in front of my face was the best way it was going to work for me. So I made like a 28-inch high armature, and same size as the crochet, and I sculpted these mass conception figures. So I started with the block figure, and the head is a box, and the thorax is a box, the pelvis is a box, and I did them in the contrapposto pose so I can get the dynamic changes throughout. And people said, did you take some wood and cut the wood and then glue it together? Well, no, because I didn't know what size they were going to be. I didn't know how they overlap, where one thing meets another, there's this overlap. It makes it dynamic, where the lower end of the thigh meets the upper end of the lower leg. I just don't go straight in. So there's an offset. So developing that so that it looked right, it felt right, was crucial. So therefore, how do I do this? I hired a model and had the model pose in that contrapposto pose, and then sculpted it and kept adjusting the size, adjusting the direction, the offset, till it kind of sung, till it was in harmony. And it was very exciting to see it come together because it was clumsy and klutzy in the beginning. Because, okay, I'm going to pile these blocks up and make contrapposto, but that's not how things work. Things have to be refined. Everything has to be refined. Right. So working from the model, adjusting, shifting, and then keeping everything square was kind of, very tedious, because I had to make it look like I cut it out of blocks of wood ultimately. Right. And everything was supposed to be 90 degrees. And it didn't, if you checked it now, you'd see that it's not exactly right. But it makes the point of the blocks, how they're stacked, how they're rotated and tipped and tilted and offset. And I really was pleased with that. Then I did the series of mass conception. Started with a block figure and then one continuous plane. And then, so it was the front plane, the side plane, bottom plane, top plane. And then, this is on the whole figure I'm talking about. Then I did the ovoid figure, where they're, instead of doing sort of complicated things, I was trying to do a simple ovoid. And then I did a tapered cones, and I forget the rest. We can show them in the insets, that series there. And I did that for the figure, I did it for the head, and did it for the hand. I figured these, everybody kind of leaves the hand for last, but I wanted to really focus on the hand and get all those planes clearly stated. So I did sort of just a plain pose, and I had the axes with wires, and then a block figure, and then a hand, a human hand photographed. I think it was mine, can't remember. So that's sort of the book and how it came together, through my teaching, through the refinement of how I would present material. Then this is before I thought about a book. It was just to survive teaching and have, do the best job I could teaching. Then I was thinking, oh, this would be a great book. Like, there's a lot of anatomy books, and I think I've got a little bit of a separate take on it. And in thinking about it, I was thinking, well, how do I present it? In class, I present a muscle, we sculpt all around it. So how do I do this in a book? So I said, well, I'll give all the essential views. So if you're dealing with an object, you want to look at the front, the back, the top, the bottom, the left side, the right side. And then you've described it as best you can on paper. So I would do that with each individual muscle. It just seemed, if I wanted to remember it, this became like, the book, not so much to make a book, but these were extension of my notes so that I could remember forever. And if I forgot, I could just refer to my book, and I'd have all that information there, just for me personally. So then I was thinking about the book, and I started mocking it up and developing it. And I spent years developing it the way I thought it would be the simplest, clearest way to present this complex, anatomy structure of the human being.
It's awesome.
And then I presented it to a publisher, wrote up a proposal. I learned how to do a proposal, wrote it up. And I spent 8 months with Watson Guptill going back and forth, and they ultimately said, well, if you take out all the technical terms, we might consider publishing it. And I said, well, the technical terms, although you have to learn a few things, it makes it easier ultimately, instead of... it's over there, down there to the side behind that on the edge, you just go on to the medial lateral corner, And if you can get the understanding of medial, lateral, anterior, posterior, you get the terminology, it becomes second nature after a while. So it had to have the terminology. So I went, I called Oxford because Oxford published Stephen Peck's book. On anatomy, which was one of my favorite books, one of my first books. I copied every illustration systematically through the book. Every major illustration, every sketch he did, copied them, and learned a lot. And so I figured, okay, Oxford published this book. I love this book, and I called. And at that time, you could. This was in the 80s, I guess, 1980s. You could talk to the editor. And so I spoke to a woman. She said that they don't really do anatomy books, and they're not really interested in another anatomy book. And I said, but you have this book in print for 50 years. She says, well, that's kind of an unusual thing. It's not what we really do. Yeah, the Peck book. I said, well, why don't I send you the outline, and if you don't like it, throw it away. You don't even have to call me back. You don't have to mail it back. Then I've done my job. I've sent it to you. So she said, okay, reluctantly. And then she called me 2 weeks later, and she said, we're interested. So when somebody says, "Oh, that's interesting," it's like a euphemism where it's not interesting.
Yeah.
So when she said, "We're interested," it's like, well, I didn't know what that meant.
To what degree?
Yeah. What kind of interest?
Yeah.
Do we have to talk further? She says, "No, we'd like to publish it."
Oh, wow.
And then I fell off the chair, and then I got up.
But what was the Watson Guptill? Was that like they were looking at it first? And
Yeah,
now
they
you
looked
had
at it
pitched
first
to
because I
Oxford?
had a connection to one of the editors there. It was somebody I met through Grand Central Art Galleries, where I met Stuart. I met an editor from Watson Guptill there. I met a lot of people there. It was a
Wow.
great place.
So did you have to go back and forth and see what like a best offer was, or was it that Watson Guptill wasn't sure?
No,
that,
Watson Guptill said no, or
okay.
they never said yes. So that was off the table.
So
And
8 months of going back and forth with them, and they never said yes.
Yeah, but I was developing the book.
Yeah,
And,
you were still going for it.
Yeah, and then maybe I was mocking it up. There was a lot of cut and paste. So one of the ways I did the book was because with so many small illustrations of regions of the body, I didn't want to draw all those separately. So I did a major top to bottom drawing, a full figure drawing of the front of the musculature, the side, and the back, which I have here. You can insert that.
Yeah, we do a picture of that.
Yeah, and then it was cropped down. So there was a lot of Xeroxing to different sizes and cutting and cropping and doing the layout. And I did the individual drawings required that would only appear once there, like the individual muscle. And then the photo of a great model, which I may have used several times. So I did this was before digital stuff. So it was like scissors and paper and Scotch tape. And then an acetate sheet overlay with my horrible handwriting labeling the muscles.
Wow.
When I did the animal anatomy book a few years later, that was all digital, and I could, it was clear. I could get the leaders that were drawn from the label to the muscle. I could get them exactly. I could move it. I could pinpoint it. It was interesting. It was fun to have done it one way and then to do it another way.
Yeah. So now Oxford says we'll take the book.
Yeah.
You give them a full, complete book, or was it like this is where the book is going to go? Like how much of the book did you give them?
I gave them the whole thing.
So the whole thing was done.
No. When they said that, then we had a contract for me to deliver the book in a year.
Oh, okay.
So they gave me an advance, and then I signed a contract, and then to deliver the book at a certain time.
So you're still at New York Academy at the time,
Yeah.
and had been teaching, and now you're continuing to teach and finish the book.
Yeah. So all my free time is on the book, drawing, and then when the year was up, it was going to take a year for me to do the book, and then a year to do production. Because there was a lot of production, a lot of editing. And one of the things I asked the editor, I said, so do you send this out to experts for review? And they said, no, you're the expert.
Yeah.
I go, oh, pressure.
Yeah.
Pressure. I got to get this all me,
Yeah. I had the same thing where they kind of came to me and obviously they do the editing. There's content editing and then there's line editing. And I was like, do we have anybody who could read it to make sure that everything is correct historically? And they were like, no, that's your job to go find somebody to help you. And
Right.
it was fun because then I gave my book to friends to be like, what do you think?
Yeah.
But that also helped the book to corral it into a language that was understandable.
Right. It strengthens it.
Yeah.
The more expertise and fresh eye you get into it from people that know about the topic, it just makes it stronger. I've seen books where they acknowledge they thank their wife and that's it.
Yeah.
And I go, wow, that's really created in a vacuum.
Okay.
If you read my acknowledgement, I have like 80 people there.
Yeah, same here.
You know.
My family, of course, because I still have to sit at the dinner table with them.
Right.
But they do sometimes read. But yeah, I mean, it's almost like a whole army, I feel like. And then multiple versions sometimes of chapters.
Yeah. Well, I studied anatomy I went to Pratt, and then I took an anatomy course with Bruce Hoheb, animal making course with him, amazing person. And then he brought us to Columbia, to the dissection lab. So that's how I got my first exposure to the cadaver and really immersed myself in anatomy.
Wow.
And the teacher that taught at Columbia, College of Physicians and Surgeons, was Al Salamini, who was a major influence on on me, my understanding, and the accuracy in the book.
Wow.
He had read the book. He scrutinized the book top to bottom, and I had done the best I could to make this accurate.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking he's not going to find a thing wrong with it. And then, back then, it was all paper. You printed it out, double spaced, and then he sent it back to me, and there were red corrections on every single page. I mean, there was no page without red marks on it. And I go, whoa. So at that moment, I sort of understand the absolute technical, anatomical, Gray's Anatomy accuracy versus what's required for an artist to understand it.
Yeah.
But to say that, so I'm not telling a lie, it's not being accurate. So,
well, we've talked about that too, where I always say, like, if a doctor came through and kind of, who does cadavers and stuff, and looked at the anatomy and drawings and sculptures and stuff, would they be impressed? And I think you were like, not really, right?
well, it's not their field. It's not something they see or look at or think about, unless they're an artist.
Yeah.
But I'm eliminating stuff to make it only applicable towards artists.
But when you see like a sculpture or a painting, are you going right over to that same like doctor, or are you just like, no, it's art, right?
No, I'm going anatomy artist.
Oh, you are? Anatomy artist, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the anatomy you see is what artistic anatomy is. So if I'm looking at a work of art, all the anatomy I see is artistic anatomy.
Right.
I mean, a doctor he's looking at superficial anatomy. So it's got to work, it's got to be accurate for the both of us.
Yeah.
But in teaching it and going beyond the skin, beyond the surface, that's where the difference is.
Yeah.
They want more stuff. They want that's not relevant to us. So we don't see the nerves. I mean, you rarely see arteries. You'll see veins a lot. So I do have a section on veins. Not something I was particularly interested in, but it's there on the surface. So and it's got to be accurate. There's patterns to the veins.
I saw on the wall on the way, and you actually have some Peck drawings, right?
Yeah, I have 3 drawings that Peck created for his book, and I got them. They were gifted to me by him and signed to me. So these are treasures of mine. This is the book I studied, copied every drawing, and now they're hanging on my wall. Those same drawings.
Wow.
So
you were able to meet him?
I met him. He lived in Pleasantville nearby.
Wow.
And the word of mouth was that he was retiring, selling his anatomical collection, and moving to Florida. And as a collector of skulls and parts of beasts and whatnot, I jumped at the opportunity and went up there and met him and purchased a number of skulls. And I had just missed a gorilla skull that somebody else had bought before me.
Wow.
But you can't have it all.
Yeah.
And then he had illustrations from his book, and I don't remember the conversation, but I wanted one. And as a sort of this historical souvenir of him, what he was about. And he let me look through them, and I said, wow, I love this, this, and this, and I don't know how to pick. And he said, why don't you take all 3? I said, I was concerned about how much. He said, okay, what do I owe you? He says, oh, nothing, you can have them. So he was selling his skulls, but he was giving away the illustrations from his book.
Wow.
So I asked him to sign them. He signed them. I framed them, and for, 30, 40 years, I see them every day and enjoy them and think of him. And I'm grateful that he wrote that book.
So was this pre your book or after you wrote your book?
I don't remember.
Because you probably would have talked anatomy and stuff with him. I would imagine you probably did when you met him anyway.
That's a good question. I will figure it out and get back to you, and you could edit it in.
That's all good, So there's also, at the Art Students League, I know, was it the 70s, where Robert Beverly Hale was giving lectures as well?
I don't remember when, but I did go and attend his lectures, and I think I attended them twice. It was amazing. It was the greatest theater that I've seen.
Yeah, they're packed, right?
Yeah, it was done as kind of like a concert with Peck on stage. I mean, with Hale on stage and
Robert
Beverly Hale, and he wrote that great book, Drawing Lessons from the Masters.
Yeah.
Is it Drawing Lessons from the Great Masters?
Yeah, I think so.
Love that book. Anatomy Lessons from the Masters was, I think, a second book, and I think Coyle pretty much did that. But my favorite is Drawing Lessons for the Great Masters. And he breaks down drawings into the different elements. Yeah. And I love that kind of stuff. I love that dissecting of drawings and, the conceptualizations, the anatomy, line, light and shade. It breaks it up into the elements. It's fantastic. Great. One of the greatest drawing books ever. So I attend his lectures, and he draws with a long stick, and sometimes he draws with chalk in both hands. And it was just this great theatrical presentation by a master. You had confidence that he was not fooling around. This was not a gimmick. This was just mastery.
Was he a student of Bridgman? Because it seemed like the same kind of show Bridgman would put on.
Well, the League, and I don't know his history.
Yeah. But it seems like they were like the big lectures that these two guys were doing. And
Rehberger also did some dramatic demonstrations.
Gustav Rehberger?
Yeah. Which I never met.
But then there's Richer too, right? Did you study the Richer book?
Richer book, yeah. That was probably my first book.
Yeah.
I guess when I was at Pratt and taking anatomy, there was the recommended books to get, and Richer and Peck, I think, were top of the list.
I know Binus now is the other one, right?
It was that's not really for artists. It doesn't break down individual forms. I just want to mention something that I always like to say about anatomy and my book, and I like to compare it to a dictionary. A dictionary has like every word you could use and a very intense definition of that. It's not a book you read cover to cover. It's a reference book that you use to clarify your understanding of an element of a word. And then, if you're writing, you put those words together. The dictionary doesn't teach you how to write. It teaches you how to understand exactly all the subtle meanings of that word. And my book is like that. My book is a dictionary of anatomical forms. It's not a drawing book. Yeah. It doesn't teach you how to put it together. Doesn't teach you the different poses and stuff. It basically teaches you the definition of each anatomical form. And then, as a separate part of the book, are the mass conceptions. So that's very different. But I like to think of it as a dictionary. It doesn't teach you how to draw, because there's some confusion. People, I read the reviews on Amazon, and I just wish people understood.
No, don't read the reviews.
Well, it gives me an understanding of what people are thinking of.
Yeah, but sometimes they're silly. I told you about the funny one that I got, right? Which is that my Art of Still Life book, somebody mentioned in the comments that they feed 2 of them to their Yorkies and they love them or something. And I was like, I don't even think that's the right review for this, but maybe you do. Right. Keep buying them.
Well, when somebody said that my book was the worst book ever published, ever, I'm thinking, well, I didn't want to be like the 3rd worst book. I wanted to be the worst book published.
You got that prize.
Yeah, I got that prize.
Wow. So back to like teaching aspect of it then, were you then asking your students at the New York Academy to purchase your book as reference as you sculpted with them?
I don't know if my book was out when I left teaching. Teaching to me was, I do a lot of different things. In my career, I've done a lot of different things. I've sculpted a lot of different ways. I kind of like to move on. I like to explore something and move on. I don't stay with one thing and stay with it.
Well, that's a good segue then. So what did you do after the academy?
Well, as far as teaching goes, I taught at the League just very briefly. I forget how that came about. I didn't meet anybody in the gallery, and I twisted my arm. I don't know if I pursued it. I thought it'd be nice to have some connection with the League and share this information. So I designed a lecture demonstration series that I did at night. And I think it was maybe 4 sessions. And I took a life-size plastic skeleton. I wanted to make this as difficult as I possibly could for myself. So I was going to do the whole body, every muscle, in 4 sessions, life-size. So I wasn't going to sculpt a skeleton. I could use a plastic skeleton. So I got one and I kind of tied it up to a stand so it was rigid. And then I got a ton of plastiline. And I think I had a model. I think I had a blackboard. So I was doing my diagrams. And I had my painted skeleton. I don't know if I had the dissection cast at the time. But at any rate, I sculpted the muscle on the life-size skeleton one at a time, like I did the egg crocheting class in the smaller scale. I was working as fast as I could, and I got through all the muscles. And I couldn't refine them as much as I wanted to. And in the lecture hall, there are people in the front who sort of had the advantage to be able to see what I'm doing, and the people in back, I don't know what they saw, but they were pretty far away. So if I had, a muscle tapered to a tendon and it's going between two muscle forms, I don't know what they saw that afterwards. But we did have breaks, and everybody came up and they studied. I encouraged them to come up and look closely at the skeleton and muscles during the breaks.
So you were at their Students' League, sounds like, for those, is it like a year or two? Or?
No, that was just
So one-off lectures at night?
Yeah, just that one lecture series, which I was never going to do again.
Yeah.
That was like running a marathon. It was a fun challenge. I like challenges, and figured it out and did it. And then I did substitute for somebody in a drawing class just for, I think, one semester. So my emphasis was on anatomy, where most of the students, that was not what they were there for. They were there for the time slot and the live model. So I did, talk about drawing and form, and you're looking at form that happens to be anatomy. It always is anatomy when you're looking at the model.
That's awesome. So then, I don't know the timeline. I don't know your timeline, but I know eventually you get to doing busts of the mayors of New York.
Yeah, so one of the aspects of my career was portrait busts. And that has a very clear start. I worked at the Museum of Natural History, my dream job. I was always interested in science and art, and I would go to the Museum of Natural History all the time. So I got a job. At first, I got a short job at the Bronx Zoo, working on the exhibits.
This is all pre-book?
This is
pre-New York County?
Yeah, this is... as a matter of fact, I dropped out of college and got my job at the Bronx Zoo, mixing resin and cement and making the habitats for the animals.
Yeah, that's awesome.
I was very interested in that, creating these environments for the animals. But that sort of didn't really give me what I wanted. So I eventually figured, why not go for the Museum of Natural History, because I could do model making, sculpture for the exhibits, whatever would be, all different kind of things are required. So I did get the job there. I worked on a drawing of a wildebeest skull, which I have the skull here and I have the drawing, and that was like my prime piece in my portfolio that I think clinched the job. So I was hired at the museum. Yeah. And I would talk to the designers about new exhibits that were coming up, about what kind of work was available. Yeah. And so I could say, well, could I do this? Could I do that? And after I was there for a while, the project came up with the Peoples of Asia Hall, and I wanted to do the mannequins. So I would be doing like these portrait heads of different ethnic types from Asia, and then the bodies, the mannequins, and then a couple of nude figures, which are these people, the Malaysians, the Samai from Malaya. And I remember the designer said, well, let me see some of your portrait work. Yeah. And I didn't have any, so I did a portrait bust of my father, and then I did a portrait bust of one of the women that worked in the department. She did the silk screens, because they knew her. They could see her and they could compare her to the bust. Yeah. And so it was a little test. I did that on my extended lunch hour. Yeah. And then, so they said, sure, you could do it. And I did the busts for the mannequins, and then the bodies were basically plywood and plaster and the chicken wire to put the costumes on. And then doing these heads, kind of like model making, where it's not about me and as an artist and my vision and my expression, it was more the scientific depiction of different ethnic types. Right. I sort of, I had been doing sculpture all along. I started out abstract when I was young, moved to the figure, but these heads were in the model making realm, not in the fine art expression realm. And there's a big difference there. Yeah. And I like doing both, but there is a very defined line between the two. Right. Some of my best work was model making. Yeah. Did a skeleton of this creature that is the missing link between fish and amphibian. It was found in Greenland by 2 scientists in England,
Wow.
and I worked with them for 3 years, creating the skeleton, which is about 2 feet long,
Wow.
and it had 180 pieces, and it was very satisfying.
Must come with
to
a
do
ton
that.
of research as well, right?
Well, they were my research. I just followed. I was a pair of hands. I didn't study, and they just fed me what I needed to know. They sent me drawings. They sent me
You
diagrams.
3-dimensionalized it.
Yeah, exactly. And then they would come from England every now and then, and we'd look at the 3-dimensional thing, which they were chipping out. They made casts of the fossil that they were chipping out. It was in a rock. It's up there. In fact, the gray resin cast.
Wow.
That's the piece.
So I actually see more. So we should actually. It's kind of like the story is dovetailing with. It now makes so much sense about why you did the animal anatomy book, right? Because
Right.
it's like that's kind of your roots, and then you went into figure and portrait and teaching, and of course you proved that you could sculpt portraits too from starting with your dad through the mannequins. So that book came out of the love for doing animals, or
The anatomy book?
yeah,
It basically my love of nature.
yeah,
So the 2 things that I've always been interested consistently is nature and art.
mm-hmm.
And then in nature, it's the forms of nature. It's the thing, the 3-dimensional thing. That's why I like collecting skulls, because it's a 3-dimensional thing, and I like cleaning them. If I'm dead animal, I clean it up. Your hands are all over it. You're going over all the forms, learning
Feeling
the
it,
forms, which is different than just looking at it on a shelf in a museum.
Right.
You're
You're studying it, yeah.
Cleaning skulls is the best way to study skulls.
Yeah.
It's fun.
That could be good and bad, or weird.
So
Not weird.
just to answer your, as we jump all over the place, just to get back to how did the mayor's bus evolve?
Yeah.
So I did these mannequin heads, and something felt lacking or unsatisfied for the artist part of me. I mean, I liked doing the heads, and they were working out well. And I worked with different curators, and it was exciting working at the museum with the collection and the costumes. But then I kind of had this urge to do an expressive portrait. And I'm a big fan of Rodin, and I used to go to the Philadelphia Rodin Museum all the time. And there was a sculptor in the department at the museum who was, he used to come to the museum like at 5 a.m. and play bagpipes in this big empty studio we had in the powerhouse. And he had a big giant mustache. I have the sculpture upstairs in resin. And I did a sculpture of him. And this was when I changed from doing very smooth to very expressive. Not very expressive, just thinking of process.
Yeah.
It's like leaving brush strokes in your painting.
Yeah.
You can smooth it out and make all aspects of your process disappear, or you can leave the process, which to me communicates with the viewer. You take them on a journey. If you leave a little bit of your underpainting showing, you leave a little bit of scumbling, you leave a brush stroke, you're taking them on a journey, even though they're looking at the end result.
They see a little bit of you in it.
Yeah, and the process.
Yeah.
So I started, and there was a teacher at the National Academy. I took, after Pratt, I went to the National Academy and took sculpture classes there. And there's one teacher, Michael Lance, who got me into the process of applying clay to build form. And you don't have to smooth that all out and get rid of the process if it makes the statement you want. If it creates the form, makes the statement, captures the likeness, shows the anatomy, and you can leave your process. That's the best of all worlds for me and for him. And that just really struck home as something that worked for me. So I wanted to use that on a life-size bust, and I had this guy Seymour pose for me. And it's one of my best pieces because it's got the freshness of sort of youth and naivete and first exploration. And then it was downhill from there. Once I got commissions and I had to satisfy other people. But I did a bunch of sculptures that were only for myself. My best work was done for me, not commissioned work. I wound up getting some portrait bust commissions, and a lot of them are posthumous, which is just like walking over a wall and banging your head against it. It is so frustrating trying to get the 3-dimensional form and a likeness and some life and character and modeling. They came out fine, but the ones I did from life were the best. So being at the museum, I was thinking, okay, who can I sculpt besides, people right around me? And one of the mayor's wives, Mrs. Lindsay, was on the board, and I asked if she would get her husband to pose for a bust, and no charge. Wow. I would take care of all of it. And she said, well, what's it for? Why should I tell him it's for? And then I was involved in the National Sculpture Society. I was a member, and I met. This is about networking. This like for all you young artists out there, networking is crucial. So meeting Stuart at the gallery, just get out of your house and go places.
Yeah. And
I met Stuart, and that led to my book. If I didn't meet Stuart, I never would have written the book.
Yeah.
And he's the first acknowledgement in the book.
Yeah.
So at the National Sculpture Society, I got work. I got referred to submit for work, and I met the director of the Museum of the City of New York, which seemed to be the perfect place to place these sculptures. So I know him from seeing him at gallery openings, our annual exhibition. I asked him, would you accept a bust of John Lindsay? And he said, well, you do it first, and I'll look and see if we want to accept it. I said, well, he's not going to sit unless you accept it, and unless you accept it, he's not going to sit. So, just take it. You don't like it, throw it away. At least you took it. So he said, okay, we'll accept it. And then so Lindsay sat for me, and he was on the west side near me. I lived on the Upper West Side. And then after that, I had connections to Beam, Wagner, and Koch. And Koch was a mayor at the time, and he started Gracie Mansion. And it was an amazing experience. And then I like opera, and I got to do a bust of Jan Pierce, the opera singer for the Met, who lived a few blocks away from me here in New Rochelle.
Wow.
And we would listen to the Saturday broadcast. So it was just, it's so exciting.
It opened a door. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then you did Raul Julia.
Did Raul Julia. My wife was in 9. She was in the original cast of 9 on Broadway. And then I asked Raul. And then at the opening night of 9, I met Al Hirschfeld in the audience.
Yeah, I was going to ask about Hirschfeld.
I was wearing a tuxedo. I looked harmless, and I told him he's my, I sort of gushed, he's like, I love his caricatures, the way he captures a likeness. That's what I try to do in my busts. But the way he captures a likeness with the most minimal amount of lines is miraculous.
Yeah.
So I asked him if he would sit for a bust. I when I saw him, it's like, oh wow, I want to do a bust of him. So it wasn't a plan. I just saw him and asked him if he'd sit, and he said, sure.
Being an artist too, I'm sure.
Yeah, yeah. I'm thinking like, I don't know if people generally don't have the time to sit, and people sat anywhere from like 5 to 12 times for a bust of an hour each, and to ask somebody to commit that time is a big ask.
Yeah.
So Hirschfeld sat at his house I said, how do I contact you? He said, my name's in the phone book. You kids remember what a phone book is? So I called him up, and
he answered?
Yeah, I think he answered, or his wife. And then what I do for the bus is I set up a little portable studio. So I bring a drop cloth to protect the floor, and then I bring 2 light stands, and I have 2 floodlights that I aim straight up, and that gives me a soft top light, and it reveals the form nicely. So as I move around, it's still the same top light. It's not a harsh form light where I don't move into shadow when I'm looking at the forms.
Yeah.
And then I bring a stool and a box so I can get the sitter eye level exactly at my eye level, and I bring a sculpture stand for the sculpture to be exactly at the sitter's eye level, and then I'm standing and my eye level matches all that. So getting back to the original question about the book, I'm just trying to make it easy. I'm making the situation as simple as possible to make it as easy as possible for me to work my best. So I've seen pictures where the sitter is sitting down on a chair and then the sculptor is standing up there, which just makes it so much more difficult. Just put the eye levels all the same, with the teaching anatomy, just get the skeleton, the dissection cast of the live model, and it makes it easier. Just make your life as easy as possible, with a little bit of work to organize how you're going to go about solving problems.
Yeah. So Hirschfeld, is there any other ones that you want to mention that you had sculpted that are like you had a great experience with, or just honor to do?
Well, the mayors, Wagner was the friendliest. Koch was very friendly, but for some reason with Wagner, maybe he was older and had more forms on his face, so I was able to do more sculpting of forms to make him more interesting. But that's one of my favorite pieces. I love that piece. I'm not into politics. I remember when he was mayor, it's not like I was in the presence of a man who led our city. It was just forms, and Koch was very serious. He wasn't the Koch, who was on for his entertainment value. He was sort of very introspective and serious, and we talked about Monty Python. So he was serious about his comedy.
Oh, that's awesome.
I was terrified and really nervous. I'm trying to have a conversation, be interesting, keep them from falling asleep, and sculpting. And I have a limited amount of shots at having them sit in person. So I would bring the sculpture back after each session and work on it from photographs and measurements that I had previously taken.
Yeah.
So I try to get it as close as possible. And then when I next saw them, I had real 3 dimensions in front of me next to my 3-dimensional thing, and it was just amazing. It was like, wow. It's like I can see stuff now that I just couldn't see in the photographs.
Right.
So
what happened? Where did they end up? Those sculptures.
The 4 busts of the mayors are all 4 in the Museum of City of New York.
Wow.
The bust of Jan Pearce is in the Metropolitan Opera House in their collection.
Wow.
The bust of Raoul Julia's in the Players Club in Manhattan. I did some commissions. I did a judge of a Court of Appeals in New York. That's in the court. So a lot of these sculptures led to paying commissions. And I did a bust almost twice life size of a developer in Florida, and that's in a building in Florida.
So let's get back to the animal anatomy book. So that one obviously came after the first one. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, that's the book I wanted to do first because, as you can see, I'm really interested in comparative anatomy. I like evolution. I like the way forms have evolved and based on what their function is. It's all fascinating to me. So I wanted to do the animal anatomy book first. And when I talked to the publisher, I guess this must have been Oxford, that I wanted to do the comparative. I don't know the sequence of the conversation where did I present the outline for the human anatomy book first and then talk about this, but I know I wanted to do the animal anatomy book first. That was my primary interest. And they said, no, there's not enough interest other than you out there to make it profitable.
No
so
audience.
do the human anatomy book. So I did that first with Oxford. And then they, I don't know if they came to me and asked me to do another book based on the sales of that book. And I said, well, now I'd like to do my animal anatomy book. And they said, okay. So I submitted a proposal. And the first book took 5 years. The animal anatomy book took 4 years. So I guess I had some experience in it, and it was a very different thing. I really dove into historical sources. So having worked at the Museum of Natural History and been through the library a lot, I did a lot of copying of drawings of other anatomists. Mostly through like proceedings of the Zoological Society of London. They would have dissect giraffes and dissected sea lions and stuff. So that research was fun, and seeing these magnificent drawings, the lithographic prints in the books. So I was able to find sources, because if I had to start from scratch, I wasn't going to be able to find giraffes and sea lions to dissect. Every time I copied a drawing, in my book I said after so-and-so, and I gave the original source. And then I would redraw it. I didn't copy it, I redrew it to have the kind of clarity that I wanted to present. A very diagrammatic, clear, everything, showing all its edges throughout. It's like an artificial, slight stylization to get the clarity that I wanted. And then on occasion I would work from original sources. So I worked from my skeleton collection that I had. For the gorilla, I was able to refer to my gorilla skull, and then trying to think of some of the different original sources. I did dissect at the Bronx Zoo. I knew the vet there, and when something interesting passed away or they euthanized it, he'd give me a call. So it wasn't things that I was going to use in the book, but it was hands-on, first-hand experience with dissecting animals. So at the zoo, I dissected a kind of antelope called a blesbok and a tiger, which I took photos for that, and that helped for the lion in my book and the cat. I dissected, from Carolina Biological, I bought an embalmed dog and an embalmed cat and dissected them. So I got my reference material from wherever I could all over the place. And then one day, the power went out in this house here, and Con Ed came and they put a cherry picker up to the transformer and pulled out a dead electrocuted squirrel.
Wow.
And I asked the guy if I could keep it. He says, I said, you keeping that? Could I have that? He said, sure. He just flings it on my lawn. And I put it in my freezer. So in my book, I think one of the only original muscle drawings from beginning to end is that squirrel.
Wow.
And I got I think I drew an actual squirrel. I didn't have a squirrel skeleton. I might have borrowed one from the museum or drawn it at the museum. But that I dissected the squirrel and did the original drawing.
Wow.
So it was fun finding all these different sources.
Wow.
And in the anatomical works in these old publications, they used to have extensive text, so you could read about how muscles it went this way and that way. And back then, it was a lot of it was muscles and skeletons, and not so much endocrine systems and arterial systems and nerves. So it was kind of stuff I liked, that kind of 19th century approach to anatomy. So it was very satisfying to get all that stuff put together and all these separate, very different kind of sources. And then when I put it together in my own style, it kind of had this coherence that I felt worked.
That's awesome. So you wrote the first book, the second book came after. You taught.
Second books always come after the first book.
Yeah, well, so you taught as well, and then you kind of left that. You stopped after the second book. Any idea ever do a third book?
Yeah, I had some ideas. One was going to be about the figure in art, anatomy of the nude. I have the whole layout there. I was going to do the whole thing. It was going to be artwork. Classical artwork from Eng to Michelangelo, and it was going to be an analysis of that view, and I would draw a skeleton in that view and then the musculature in that view, probably just a superficial, maybe a deep musculature view, but never happened. It was going to be a little too difficult to figure out the anatomy. Like with Eng, it was so subtle. I mean, his anatomy is all correct, but the figuring out I have to do was going to be just too much to really get it right. And then with Michelangelo, he had so many bumps that sometimes it's really hard to decipher it. Is this part of a deeper muscle? Is this a superficial muscle subdividing into separate forms? I mean, he used the potential for all muscles to create different kinds of forms to design with.
Yeah.
So we're left with responding to his work emotionally, but to use it as a lesson was going to be, I think, just too frustrating, and I sort of lost interest in doing it.
That's more of in his drawings, right? His sculptures were less brutalist.
There was very good clarity. There was a simplified clarity in his drawing, in his sculptures, but the drawings, I don't think I could have accurately, with confidence, just picked out every bump and decided what it was.
So to keep going then with the timeline, so then you were doing the sculptures of the mayors and Hirschfeld. What came after that? Because I know you did stuff for the PGA, right? Or
yeah, I did a trophy of Jack Nicklaus in 1998, and that was really part of my model making work. I wanted to do it aesthetically. Model making is making something three-dimensional for a purpose. Mm-hmm. It's got to be a certain way, but it's got to be done aesthetically. Mm-hmm. So the scientists didn't really say, well, how are you going to do this aesthetically? They said, how are you going to do this accurately? And I said, okay,
Right.
we're going to do this, this, and this. Then for me personally, I'm going to do it aesthetically. It's got to be beautiful.
Right.
The forms have to flow. The forms have to have distinctness, which whether I did it well or poorly aesthetically, I don't know if they would have noticed,
Right.
because they were only interested in accuracy. But
Right.
to me, the aesthetic presentation of anything is crucial to doing it the right way.
Right.
For
Oh, it's the
me.
art of it, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Right. And that's the science of it. Kind of
Yeah,
like what you're talking
so
about.
in this section you have model making, and here you have art. This is about it's got to be accurate. If I'm doing a figure or a portrait, it's got to look like the person. It's got to have the correct structure, but it's got to have a feeling, and maybe leaving the procedure in. Where in the model making you don't want procedure, the feeling will come from the aesthetic qualities that are done well, that are not hitting you over the head. Right. Be done something aesthetically. It's almost like if you walk down the street, you can walk in a klutzy way, or you can just walk elegantly. So you're still getting to where you need to go, but do you want to do it in a clumsy way, or do you want to do it aesthetically? Always walk aesthetically.
That's funny. So you did PGA.
I did that trophy. That was model making. That was probably the most lucrative thing I ever did. And it was fun. It was a challenge. I had one photograph to work from of Jack Nicklaus, and I had to make it three-dimensional. So I hired a model. I tried to get the same type of clothes he was wearing, and I sculpted it nude. I didn't show those pictures to the PGA, but I sculpted it nude to get the figure on it. Mm-hmm. And then to do clothing, you basically just add pleats. So you want the sense of the figure underneath, like the shoulder and the hips and the elbows. Everything has to look like it's sitting underneath clothing. Mm-hmm. So I started with a nude and did that. And the head was like this big, so I had to keep doing it over and over again, send pictures to the PGA. They sent it to Mrs. Nicklaus. She would make comments. They would send the comments back. I would redo it, send pictures to PGA. They'd send, and it was going back and forth. And that was, again, the hitting your head against the wall. But eventually they accepted it, and we cast it, and we did that for a number of years.
Wow.
But that was, kind of an anomaly, these model making projects. I did a bust of Evita for a TV commercial. I did various things that were model making. I felt, I have a responsibility to make a living, but I like the challenge.
Yeah.
I like fixing things, because it's the challenge. If something breaks, how do I fix it so you can't tell I fixed it?
Yeah.
I like challenges.
So that takes you to 1998, and then after that, like, how do we bridge the gap between there and kind of where you are today?
Gardening.
Well, I know, because I know you moved so much through your interests in things.
Well, after that, I pretty much stopped sculpting, in a sense. Although you could say that my involvement in gardening was sculpting, because I'm using form and creating form and modifying form with the pruning. I love pruning, and I really got into garden design. So the way I approached anatomy years ago, where I read everything and immerse myself completely, I did the same thing with gardening. I totally immersed myself in it, read everything about it, the history, the design concepts, go to all the gardens I could go to, do research. So here's my interest in science and art, once again, leading me on. So the same with anatomy and sculpting, science and art. It was now botany and garden design. So science and art. And very satisfying, and I think I had some good results over the years. So that pretty much occupied my time, got me out of doors, good exercise.
Yeah.
But when it starts to work, when the forms come together, and it's a partnership, because nature keeps changing.
Yeah.
Whereas clay, I put it down, it stays there until I move it. With nature, I plant something, and then it changes. Yeah. Then I can move it, but then it still changes, and a lot of times it dies. Yeah. So it's kind of very humbling working with nature in that way. But the satisfaction of working with aesthetics and design was the same in gardening as it was, sculpting trophies or portraits or my own animal sculpture.
Yeah. Do you ever see yourself get back into sculpting, or you feel like this is sculpting? I know that, but
I have no idea what the future holds for me.
Yeah.
Except one day I won't have to pay taxes.
Awesome. Well, I think that's a great place to wrap it up. Is there anything else you want to add?
I did want to talk about the very beginning of getting involved with nature and studying anatomy. I was in 8th grade, And I lived in this house at the time, and in my backyard I would see raccoons periodically, and I saw a dead raccoon. My science teacher in 8th grade told me how to prepare it because I wanted the skull. So I buried it, and I left it for a few weeks, and then dug it up, and I took the skull, and he told me how to soak it and then clean it. And that skull is right up there in the corner.
Wow.
So I have that skull, and that was kind of like the catalyst, that just turned the switch on to me being fascinated with forms of nature.
Yeah.
And I just, as I'm cleaning it and scrubbing it and looking at it, and then I would find another skull, and then I'd find another skull, and I'd look at what are the similarities and differences. Okay, they have a snout, they have eyes. Where are the eyes? And the teeth. The teeth tell a big story of how it made its living. Did it kill? What did it eat? Did it chew? Did it shear? Stuff like that. So, that's how I got involved. And those forms tell the story of evolution. So again, form was always my interest. And that skull was the beginning, led to the collection. The collection led to, my getting deeper involved in it, studying anatomy, and then producing the book. So, while I think of everything as being all these disjointed interests of mine, there is a theme that runs through, which is the respect and love and admiration of nature and what goes on in nature.
Yeah.
And then how do I put something out? How do I take all this input and do my output, which is the creative side, which was primarily sculpting. It's like a good lesson is respect for nature to anybody, because if they will respect nature, hopefully they'll respect the rest of the world.
Awesome. All right. It's a good place to wrap it up. Anything else you want to add?
No, that's it. I've told you everything that I know.
All right. Cool. Thanks for taking the time.